Good morning. Thank you all for being here. I want to start by acknowledging that we're holding this meeting on unceded Algonquin territory and to give our appreciation for being allowed to do so. And then administratively, so I don't forget, bathrooms out the door to the right and then to the right. And we have a sign-up sheet, which if you would print your name so we can read it, and print your email address just to make sure that we have you all on our list. That would be great. Thank you very much. So, very exciting, wonderful to see you all here. My name is Diana Majuri, and I'm a member of the Gender Equality Measurement Project Group team. And along with my colleagues Doris Buss, Christina Gabriel, Lisa Mills, and Pauline Rankin. So we are the GEM team. And on behalf of them, I want to welcome you all to our event this morning. I think it's going to be an amazing morning of sharing critical information and critical analysis, and I anticipate lots of lively discussion because these issues are so omnipresent and so hard and so important. So we are very pleased to be co-hosting this event with two SSHRC-funded projects, the Engendering Public Engagement, Democratizing Public Space project. And this symposium is one in a series of public engagement projects that are being organized as part of a project that is going to build towards public consultation around the 50th anniversary of the Royal Commission on the Status of Women in 2020. So things to look forward to in the future. So we thank Barbara Cameron, who is the principal investigator on that project, for her support and her participation. The other co-sponsor is the Violence Against Women Hub of the Community First Impacts of Community Engagement project. I'm the academic co-lead on that project with my community partner, Kim Pate, who is the executive director of the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies. So we're pleased to, both groups, to co-sponsor this event with GEM. And would like to thank the Faculty of Public Affairs for their financial support as well. And many thank yous. So thank you to Aishagul Ergel, Anna Shednovic, and Maggie, I was nervous about the pronunciation of that, and Maggie Fitzgerald, who have been our research assistants on this project, and they have been beyond amazing in the work that they have done. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to Carleton University Research Office, who has funded the GEM project for 3 years. So we are in our last year of funding, and but it is their funding that made this event possible. So I'm going to just say a few words about GEM, and there's more information in the bio sheet. So there's a bio of GEM as well as the people. We came together in 2011 as Carleton feminist researchers from a variety of different disciplines, but we all worked generally on the issues of women's equality, gender equality, and in the public policy sphere. And we were all becoming anxiously haunted by the increasingly dominant language of measurement and indicators, the seemingly insatiable need for numbers, more numbers. So the sense that if it's not real, if it's not quantifiable, was making us very anxious. At the same time, of course, we recognized that numbers and data are incredibly important, and so we didn't want to diminish the importance of them. But concerns about the narrowing focus, concerns about what was being framed and reframed and by whom, and what was being left out, and probably even most deeply concerned about what was not even being considered. I was listening to the radio the other day and heard an interview with Tanya Takak, a throat singer, and she apparently has paired up with a rock band. And so the interviewer was saying to her, "Throat singer, rock band? How on earth did you two get together?" And her response was, "If you want to find new things, you cannot overcategorize." And I thought, that's it, right? So in our anxiety to categorize, to document, to a large extent, what we already know, so for example, the prevalence of violence against women, things that we definitely do need to persuade others about, the prevalence of violence against women, but are we shutting ourselves down to new ways of looking at, thinking about, working on our issues? And is that what we're doing in our over-categorization? Again, with respect to violence against women, we so need new ideas for how to move forward and deal with the issues that are still so prevalent and so problematic. So those are the kinds of questions that Jem was worrying about and that brought us together. And the other thing is we like working together so much. So I, as an aside, just want to say, one, how privileged and lucky I feel being part of this team, but how important it is to work with allies and people that respect you and that you can have fun together with. So that's such an important part of this work. And that's us at Jem. And we get the work done too, so that's very impressive. So this morning's event has been a long time coming, and it was almost scuttled at the last minute. So Sally Mary's flight was canceled yesterday, and they put her on the last flight out of New York. And all of us who do this kind of flying know the last flight may not fly. So we feel very lucky that, exhausted as she may be, that we have her here in person and not on Skype this morning. But for one of our first undertakings as the GEM group was to do some reading together. And one of our first readings was a piece that Sally Mary co-authored called Technologies of Truth in the Anthropology of Conflict. And we had such a wonderful evening talking about it. And we were all just jazzed up and so excited by her work. So we loved it. She was articulating the concerns in a brilliant way, as opposed to our sort of being haunted by. She was articulating the kinds of concerns and dilemmas that we were feeling ourselves around data and collection and measurement. So we were totally blown away. And we committed that night to bringing Sally to come and speak to us and to others. And it's taken us a while to get you here, but we're so pleased to have you come. So you have Sally Mary's bio in your material, so I'm not going to go through that. And really to read through her accomplishments would take us all morning. I bought a bunch of her books and thought, okay, I have all of Sally Mary's books. I'm so proud of myself. Then I go on the website and I have like a quarter of her books. She is beyond prolific. It's unbelievable how she does it. So just in terms of basic information, Sally Engle Merry is the Silver Professor of Anthropology at New York University and Faculty Director of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at the New York University School of Law. And I just want to add one piece that made me smile, and that is that she's received an honorary doctorate from McGill University. So that seemed very nice. So she's going to speak to us from her most recent book, The Seductions of Quantification, Measuring Human Rights, Gender Violence, and Sex Trafficking. And on top of everything else, she's amazing with titles, and that's such a skill. I really admire title skills. So with bated breath, I turn us over to Sally Engle Merry.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. Let me see what I'll do with my papers. And I should begin by saying it's lovely to be in the land of Trudeau and away from the land of Trump. We're so jealous. And we have the opportunity to see a political candidate with a level of misogyny which we haven't seen for a long time, who has, as he puts it, the courage not to be politically correct. It's pretty appalling. But in any case, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm so pleased to be with others who share my skepticism about quantification in a world where this is sweeping governance, as you all probably know. I have given talks to much less sympathetic audiences who are very unhappy about my level of critique of quantification, whose careers and lives are premised on it. And it's actually kind of hard to mount this kind of a critique, and people are not really happy to hear it. I I began studying. I feel a little nervous because some of the people here are much more sophisticated about statistics than I am, I suspect. And I'm an anthropologist, and I got into this work through looking at processes of compliance with human rights, with the ways quantification and other mechanisms are used to get people to behave in a better way in terms of the human rights system. So I'm really a legal anthropologist. And I began to see that these numbers were getting more and more prominent in the kinds of governance processes that I've been studying. And in fact, there's a phenomenon now called new governance, which argues that we need to have a different kind of governance structure in which instead of having top-down command and control, we have this iterative process where you do something, then you gather data, you see how it works, you may change your policies, and so there's this kind of learning process, which sounds great, but it is based on this notion that you can count and understand things. And so I began to wonder about the counting understanding process. And in the process of doing that, I wanted to move beyond the normal view that you can cheat with statistics. We all know that. But what I wanted to see is how the very production of this quantitative knowledge is actually a social and cultural process. It depends on who's doing it, what the power structure is behind those who get to do it, what kinds of models they're using, where the templates come from. And since I've been studying human rights, can you all hear me all right? I was particularly interested in how these things travel, because in many ways, these kinds of quantified systems are developed within the global north, particularly among cosmopolitan elites in the global north, and then they're disseminated around the world without really a lot of attention to whether or not they make sense of local communities. So I began to get interested in how we allow this form of knowledge, which is partial and often misleading and certainly makes some things visible and ignores other things, and yet it has what I call a seductive quality. It gives us the sense that we can know the world. And we live in a world that's incredibly complicated, in which we don't really know how much corruption is going on in Botswana, or whether or not there is transparency in the government of the United States, or whether or not which country we want to go to that's human rights compliant. So we live in this, and what levels of development exist. So we live in this incredibly complicated world, and what numbers offer us is a way to know, a way to be objective and fair. And they also give us a sense that there are rational, objective ways to make political decisions. We don't have to just argue about values. We can really just look at the numbers. So what are those numbers, and how are they produced? And it's clear to me from looking at it that they are actually produced through the very kinds of political, social power processes that we see in many other domains of life. So I call them the seductions of quantification. And I have to tell you a little bit about this. Is the book I just finished, and I just want you to check out the cover. I called it The Seductions of Quantification, and it has as a subtitle, Sex Trafficking. And the publisher's first proposal for a cover was that they would use these red numbers to do a stiletto shoe on the cover. And they sent this to me and said, the marketing department loves it. This is the University of Chicago Press, this is not right. And I said, I don't really know if I kind of like that image. So they agreed to make it a map instead. They said it delayed the book, and there was clearly some unhappiness that I didn't want to use this sexist image. But anyway, so the battles go on and on. So I wanted to talk about, I got interested in the use of quantification because it seems to me it has two basic effects. One is what I call the knowledge effect. It shapes the way we see and understand the world. And by measuring things, we come to get a sense of what they are, and sometimes the measurement becomes the thing itself. So we don't really know what intelligence is, but we think there's an IQ test. And so you say, well, this person has this or that IQ. So the measurement mechanism becomes what intelligence is. And this happens all the time. There are lots and lots of efforts now to measure something called the rule of law. This is a very murky concept with lots of different ways of doing it. And sooner or later, some measurement system is going to become predominant, and that's going to define what the rule of law is. And we've seen this with human development, with corruption. These are all incredibly complicated things that we are now trying to measure. At the same time, the things we don't measure at all. You all probably know about this historical problem that when we started looking at economic development by looking at how much income people are making as a way of measuring work, the unpaid labor that was taking place in the fields and by women was ignored because the focus was really on just measuring paid labor. There's now recognition that there's something called care, which is actually takes a lot of people's time and energy, particularly female people, caring for children, old people, managing the family. And that if we want to measure economic activity, we maybe need to measure this too. So one strategy is to do what are called time use studies. And if I can just give you another one of my favorite stories about this. I heard a presentation at the UN once about the time use studies of how you measure this care work. And so the argument is that you look at the salaries that people get paid for doing this care work, and then you figure out how many hours the person spent, and if this is the normal pay rate, then that's the way you would measure it. But they said, if you have a child care worker doing it, that person's a professional, and if you have a mother, that's not. So we'll just give them 75% of the financial value of doing this work professionally. This is one of these moments when the sheer arbitrariness of this is just so stunning, and yet these arbitrary decisions get incorporated into numbers and indicators, and you lose touch with all those arbitrary decisions. And this is the tip of the iceberg. I was particularly interested in these big indicators like transparency, the Corruption Perceptions Index, the Human Development Index. There's something called Freedom in the World that measures freedom. And the World Bank has a lot of governance indicators. And these things are all made up of other indicators. So you take the initial data, which may or may not be well done, and then you mush them together and you sort of see if they compare statistically, and you come up with a single rank or score. It's very appealing, right? You don't have to worry. But the chain between the actual data and all the interpretive work that goes into it to that final score is very long and very problematic and very infused by relations of power. So this is the kind of framework I've been thinking about. There is what I call a knowledge effect, in that this creates the world, and sometimes through what Latour calls a black boxing thing, where you look at these final ranks, but you actually don't know how they've been produced. I don't know if this is as true in Canada, but we spend a lot of time fretting about the rankings of colleges and universities and law schools, particularly law schools, and yet, do we really know what criteria are used, how the data is produced? There's certainly efforts to manipulate it. Are the values that are in that ranking system the same values that you have or somebody else might have? It gets sort of collapsed underneath these measures. Okay, so that's the knowledge effect, and then there's a governance effect, how these things get used for political decision making. And some of them are used directly, so that, for example, the US developed something called the Millennium Challenge Corporation, in which countries had to satisfy certain indicators in order to get funding. And some are used indirectly, some of the ones that I've mentioned, where they just shape the way you understand the world. You're all probably familiar with grades. Do you call them marks or grades? Which are another iteration of this. So you take a highly diverse group of student performances and you put them on a single scale, as if every A is the same, every B is the same, and this then creates a world of differently skilled people. So you actually produce knowledge through this mechanism, and then that obviously has effects on jobs and careers and so on. So there's this knowledge effect and the governance effect. Okay, so that's all my kind of introduction. What I want to talk about today is a particular initiative to create a global survey to measure violence against women. So this is part of the book that I'm talking about, and as I say, there are people here who've been, like Holly, involved in this very process, so she may have different perspectives on it than I do. But I wanted to begin in talking about this process to talk about what it means to quantify something in the first place, using my example of violence against women, which is a topic that you all have probably thought a lot about. But I want to point out that actually converting something into numbers requires a good deal of work to make it this complex social reality, something you can count. I recently went to a meeting where a group of lawyers and legal aid activists were trying to come up with indicators for access to justice. And I mean, it was suddenly clear to me how difficult this is, because they were all doing legal aid, so they said, well, it's a matter of whether you have a lawyer or not. Well, you can count that readily. But then they said, so some lawyers are good and some are bad, and some spend a long time and some spend a short time. So they said, well, let's count the number of minutes that the lawyer spends with the client. You begin to see this is hard to measure. And then they said, well, let's just look at whether the client wins or not. But maybe the client's not right. I mean, so then they said, well, let's look at justice. Did the person get justice? Well, at this point, this is gone. I don't think they actually succeeded, but you can see how difficult it was. Yeah, these smart, engaged people, but converting the whole question about what is a fair system that provides access to justice into something you can measure is really hard. Of course, ironically, this was done in the offices of a law firm called Skadden Arps, which, if any of you are lawyers, you know is a big, fancy New York law firm right on Midtown with these huge hallways, which in Manhattan is very extravagant. And they were doing pro bono work. So anyway, what gets done here? So here is, if I can figure out how this works. Okay, so what I'm arguing is that in order to make things quantitative, you have to engage in 3 steps. The first is you have to find something in common that you can measure, that all these things have in common. And if you think about how to do this with violence against women, this is not an easy thing. Violence against women includes a vast array of things, from sex trafficking to honor killing to female genital cutting to domestic violence to rape to dowry murders. I mean, we could go on, right? There are many, many sexual violence in wartime. So what do all these have in common? How would we go about coming up with some core thing by which we can count them all? So that's the first problem, and we'll talk a little bit about how to do this, but you can see that it's very difficult, and the tendency to narrow down what your core principle is in order to make it countable is very great. So here we are back to my legal aid people trying to measure justice in the courts. They probably would have to end up saying, did you have a lawyer or not? Because that's one thing that is equivalent that you could count, but that's clearly an inadequate way. Okay, the second step is to come up with categories that you can use to count. And these categories have to be both clearly mutually exclusive, you have to be able to fit into one or the other, and they have to be all-encompassing. So you have to have a set of categories that cover everything you want to do, and that you can clearly decide that something is in one or another. Now, this probably seems self-evident to you, but the categories actually construct the reality. Think about our census data. You're asked on the census what gender you are, right? Now, we assume that this is a clear, unambiguous thing. You're either one or the other, and that you know what it is. And because the census is that way, we construct these categories in clear, unambiguous ways. But it's becoming clear that that's actually not the way the world is, that we could think of gender as a continuum, not as 2 categories. But the census data, the census approach assumes the categories and assumes that you can handle them that way. So which categories you choose and how you define those categories is actually a cultural process. I use the example of gender. Do you have race in your census? Do you ask about race? What? Visible minority? Is there just one? There's the default white and visible minority? Many. But what these categories are very complicated. There are lots of countries that don't measure race at all. Actually, the convention that monitors racial discrimination has difficulty because a lot of countries are reluctant to come up with racial categories. And I know about the US, we constantly change our racial categories, and the racial categories are a mixture of kind of color and ethnicity and nationality, and are you a white Hispanic or a non-white Hispanic? And of course, none of this does any justice to the actual complexity of the way race shapes people's lives. And do you measure religion? in your census? We don't. But which are categories of religion? Who decides? Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, with multiple religions, subdivisions? Do you have Shia, Sunni, Muslims? Anyway, just to show you that creating these categories is an important piece of cultural work that is by no means self-evident. And third, you have to be able to sort things into these categories. So you have to be able to say, this is a category and I can tell which one this belongs in relatively easily, which of course is the problem with race. And again, I'll give you a US example. It's actually very hard to know, so we've turned from the visible census taker at the door to self-report, which has produced all sorts of interesting things, like lots of people in Hawaii say they're Hispanic and Asian American both. And, you know, so it begins to undermine the whole system of categories when the categories are not clear. So encoding means that you have to be able to sort people into categories, and the demands of encoding mean that your categories have to be somewhat limited so that they are clear and unambiguous. Okay. So this is all to say, how do you go about doing this when you're trying to measure violence against women? Now, I'm going to give you a little history of the particular project that I studied, which is a UN project. Is there a screen over there? Is that why you're looking over there? This is a project that the UN has a long history of interest in violence against women, dating back really to the early 90s, when it was declared a human right at the 1993 Vienna Conference on Human Rights, but it has gotten increasing attention. Some of the latest initiatives came with the 2006 Secretary General's report called An In-Depth Study of All Forms of Violence Against Women, which is really the first time that there was a major study of this problem done by the UN. And happily, the advisory board included a lot of feminists, so it has a pretty feminist perspective to it. I guess I let my politics sneak out there. And there were other UN efforts. There was a 2008 Unite to End Violence Against Women campaign. Another interesting development is that the Human Rights Council, which is the body of the UN, which monitors compliance with human rights treaties and with the state of human rights in the world, appointed a special rapporteur on violence against women in 1994. And this is a person whose task it is to both do country visits and then to produce reports, sometimes theoretical overview reports, about the problem that she's working on. There's some 30, 35 people with these positions. And in 2008, the special rapporteur took on the project of coming up with indicators on violence against women and made a report to the Human Rights Council. She also did a major survey working with Liz Kelly, who some of you may know, in the UK. So this, again, was kind of a feminist perspective on how you might think about developing an indicator on violence against women. There was an expert group meeting in 2007 to work on this. A series of indicators were produced in large part by the work of Sylvia Walby, who again is a feminist scholar from the UK who had done a lot of research on violence against women in the UK. But notice we begin to see where this work has been done in the past. And this was presented to the UN Statistical Commission. You may or may not know that there is something called a UN Statistical Commission. I have been doing research on it for several years. It's an interesting creature that has a fairly low visibility, but this is an commission, like other UN commissions, made up of countries. There are about 46 country members, and other countries come. It meets 4 days a year in the UN offices in New York, and its mandate is to provide guidelines and templates and survey models for the national statistical offices around the world. The goal is to facilitate better statistical practice by all these national statistical offices, and also to homogenize ways of doing it. They initially began in the 1940s working on economic statistics. Increasingly, they've turned to social statistics, measuring things like gender, and now beginning to look at violence against women, gender-based violence. So there has been kind of an expansion, but they don't actually do the measurement. The meetings are a big room with maybe 500 or 600 people in it, and they're typically all statisticians. It's an interesting world for an anthropologist to be doing ethnography on. So I forgot to say that my point is that I looked at all this as an anthropologist doing ethnography on this process. So they looked at this proposed list of indicators, created a special committee called the Friends of the Chair to work on the indicators and to develop, ultimately, guidelines for them. So they had a meeting to develop guidelines in 2009, and we're going to talk about what their guidelines were. And then this came up for discussion at the UN Statistical Commission. Some countries objected that they shouldn't put in female genital cutting because it was too sensitive. Other countries objected that you can't include child marriage because by UN definitions, child marriage is under children are 18 and below, and some countries have marriage permitted below that age, so how could you do that? So there was this kind of debate about which countries wanted what included, and then the Friends of the Chair Committee went on to finalize the indicators and then produce the guidelines. Now, finalizing the indicators, it came back to the UN Statistical Commission a couple of times. There was no discussion. After that 45-minute discussion, it was forgotten. Interestingly, the person who was responsible for developing these indicators was a member of the UN Statistical Division, which is the so-called Secretariat. These are the offices of people who run the thing, so that when the Statistical Commission decides to do something, it's the Secretariat that does it. And he came from a background in household demographic studies. He told me he knew nothing about gender violence. He was going to work with the Commission on the Status of Women to tell him what to measure. He was just interested in getting the statistics right. So again, you can kind of see the different orientations that groups have. Now, simultaneously with this process, there was a second initiative organized by the UN Economic Commission for Europe and the UN Economic Commission for Latin America. That's UN ECE and UN ECLAC. If you want to do the UN, you got to do all these letters and acronyms. It really is mind-boggling. The first review I read of my book said, there are really an awful lot of these letters and acronyms in there. The first time I started going to the UN, they had training sessions for NGOs about how to make sense of all these names, because it's really overwhelming. And then once you get used to it, anyway. So you don't realize you're talking this kind of jargon. So they held an expert group meeting. I think there were several, which I went to one, where the idea was to come up with a survey module which could be used by this UN Statistical Commission initiative, because this was going to get a lot of publicity. Actually, the guy doing it in the UN Statistical Division told me he had plenty of money. How often do you hear that? To do any kind of survey and any work he wanted. Lots of people were excited about this. So this is another group that got different funding, and in contrast to the Statistical Commission effort, this group was full of people who understood gender-based violence, had done research on it, and they were informed by a very important project done by the WHO, which of course you all know is the World Health Organization, which produced a multi-country survey of violence against women in 2005. And this was done with lots of attention to how you frame the questions, how you organize the interview session. Because if you go to a household and you say, I would like to interview the woman of the household alone on the subject of domestic violence, she may not tell you too much. I mean, and if you're sitting there and she's telling you about her experiences of violence and her husband walks in the room, it's likely that this is not a good thing and she's not going to tell you. So in order to do an interview like this, you have to actually be very thoughtful about how you do it, how you present it, how you get an opportunity to talk to a woman alone, how you maximize disclosure, and how you train your interviewers. So this WHO project had put a lot of time and energy into thinking this out, in providing local services so that if women got upset, they had somebody they could talk to. This is not normally done in household surveys, which are much more straightforward. So the idea was they wanted to come up with a survey instrument that the UN Statistical Commission could use. But there was a little tension because there are different ways of thinking about how to do this. In 2010, the Friends of the Chair finished their meetings. They proposed a set of indicators. This was approved by the Statistical Commission. And in 2013, the Statistical Commission published the guidelines for producing statistics on violence against women, statistical surveys, a book which is available online if any of you want to read it. So that's kind of the history of what was done. I asked the Statistical Commission guy why they were only looking at violence against women, not violence, not gender-based violence, but violence against women. And he said, well, that's what we've been talking about. That's what this, special report of the Secretary General's report is about, so that's what it is. So you get the feeling the UN is this giant ship and turning it is difficult and slow. All right, so these are the indicators I'm supposed to stop in half an hour. Okay. These are the indicators they came up with. And I want to go through them a little bit, and then we'll talk about these equivalence categorization problems. So it's a little mind-numbing. I apologize for this. So the first one is total and age-specific rate of women subjected to physical violence in the last 12 months by severity of violence, relationship to the perpetrator, and frequency. So what they're looking at is severity, relationship to the perpetrator, and how often it happens. And then we have, the first one is for the last 12 months, and the second one is for lifetime. There is some concern that people forget about things that happened in the past. They may not remember the frequency. This is well known in crime victimization surveys. It's really not an accurate way of doing things. I actually did my dissertation on the fear of crime in a Boston urban neighborhood, and I discovered at that point that lots of people didn't really remember their criminal experiences, or they might remember those that were emotionally upsetting, but I also did a survey of actual victimization, and there were lots of things that happened to them that they didn't even remember. So this is a problem with these kinds of frequency measures as well. And so the idea is the 12 months might be more accurate than the lifetime, but so that is the variation between 1 and 2 here. Notice this is just physical violence. So if we look at 3 and 4, you find it's the same structure, but it's sexual violence. So again, we have sexual violence for 12 months and for a year. So notice that embedded within these indicators is the assumption that you can separate physical and sexual violence, which I think you all probably recognize is not a realistic assessment, and that they frequently go together, and yet, so this is again a cultural category and must make it more difficult to encode responses. So the indicators go on. Then we have, the first 4 just have relationship to the perpetrator. Now the next 2 actually focus only on intimate partners. So it's total and age-specific rate of ever partnered women. Remember, we're looking at the ratio. So do we look at the ratio of the violent experiences of all women or women who have partners? And this would make a huge difference. So these are the kinds of judgments that go into these indicators that we then lose. Subjected to sexual and or physical violence by current or former intimate partner in the last 12 months by frequency. So interestingly, when we get to the intimate partner, the 2 are blended. Sexual or physical violence, and we still have the distinction between 12 months and lifetime. I will say that the statisticians were not happy about this because they say, look, these are overlapping categories. These 2 actually are embedded in the same as the first 2, but they blur the physical and sexual while separating the intimate from the other in a way that the first doesn't. So there's a sort of statistical incoherence here. But as the statistician said, those feminists really insisted on doing it that way. I don't think he said feminists. Those women insisted on having it that way. Okay, and then finally we have psychological violence. Interestingly, only intimate partners apparently could exert psychological violence. Economic violence by intimate partner, and female genital mutilation, that's what they still call it. It's interesting that there was objection from countries about measuring female genital cutting when it came up at the UN, but this Friends of the Chair Committee stuck it back in anyway. Now, and the statistician who was working on this told me that female genital cutting is an easy thing to measure because it either is or it isn't. And, when you think about the secrecy of the whole thing, I found this a very surprising comment. And yet, if you compare it to the murkiness of trying to understand when and how people might have been subjected to violence, you can see it actually is probably more straightforward. Was this hit or choke part of a disciplinary thing? Is this part of marriage? Is it an act of violence? Is it a form of violence against women? These are interpretive projects at the very basic state of doing this kind of research, which is less true of female genital cutting. So, what are the principles? So this was the basis of equivalence. So this is what we're measuring in this global survey. So let's look at what the basic underlying principles are. First of all, only women are victims. Gender is unambiguous. We know women when we see them, and we're not really worrying about violence against men. I mean, there's a big debate about whether or not violence against men should be viewed as equal to violence against women, but it is the case that there is a tendency to really ignore forms of violence against men in prison, in racially based violence, and all sorts of other ways, which is itself a puzzling thing. I don't think they should necessarily be equated. Statistically, women are injured much more than men by violence, and yet there is certainly a limitation going on here. Okay, it also assumes that all violence against women is physical, sexual, psychological, or economic, and that you can identify which is which, and that you can see this across cultural differences, which again is problematic. Don't forget, this is a survey which has to travel around the world. There's no acid throwing, etc. Okay, then it suggests that the variation that matters is age, severity, relationship to perpetrator, and frequency. So you can begin to think about all the things that are missing here. Things like ideas about kinship, marriage practices, poverty, the trajectory of the relationship, the possibilities of leaving or not leaving. And of course, as we all know from various projects on violence against women and the whole movement, there's a whole range of things from intimidation to insult to humiliation, isolation, attacks on children, on pets, which can be as, if not more painful than the actual physical act. But none of that is included here because it's too hard to measure, too hard to make travel, too hard to pin down. I spent a fair amount of time studying a women's support group in a community in Hawaii, and it was clear that when women talked about this, it was in terms of the trajectory and the relationships, the attitudes about gender and marriage and family that shaped the world that they lived in that really made a difference in both how they thought about it and what they did about it. But that is not here. And then finally, there's the assumption that violence between intimate partners is fundamentally different from violence in other relationships, and that it's possible to distinguish intimate from non-intimate relationships in all societies, which is actually, I mean, if you have to think about how this is going to translate, does this make sense? Can you really make this clear distinction? Could it be family, non-family? But what else are you going to do? So I'm not saying that this is necessarily a bad set of indicators at all. I'm saying that this is fundamental to the process of quantification. You have to create boundaries and edges and focus on things that are comparable. And so by definition, you miss certain things. You actually miss a lot of things. Okay. So the next thing you have to do is to figure out what your categories are. And notice that one of the categories in this survey is whether or not the violence is moderate or severe. Is there any judgment involved in that kind of distinction? And that's actually an important distinction because, as you all probably know, there has been this ongoing argument that there's too much focus on violence against women, that most of it is mild. It's really not a problem. We only really want to worry about the severe cases. I mean, that's just sort of the right-wing resistance. And there is this interesting phenomenon that women often put up with violence that is increasingly severe for a long time until they finally decide to act. And once they begin to act, then they'll resist even more moderate forms of violence. And so there's a trajectory in a person's life experience which affects whether or not they're resisting things that are more moderate or more severe. But who decides what's moderate or severe? And the Friends of the Chair Committee grappled with this problem somewhat unsuccessfully. They didn't actually really settle it, but they tried. They considered 4 different approaches. You could look at the acts themselves. Was it a hit, a slap, a threaten with a gun, etc.? So some acts being more severe than others. And of course, they didn't consider things like acid throwing or some of the suggestions by a member of the committee from Bangladesh were interesting, like needle the finger, dropping from on high, So you could see they're sort of culturally specific forms of actions. And the actions that they were looking at were predominantly kind of global northwest actions. You could look at injuries. That seems like a reasonable thing. So what do you measure? Do you measure, did you go to the hospital? Well, you can immediately see how difficult that is. How far is the hospital? Is there a hospital? Do you have transportation? Are you in a world where people normally go to hospitals with problems? So that actually measures other things than really whether there were injuries. Again, this Bangladeshi representative suggested that you look at, was there bleeding? So you can see the struggle to come up with something concrete. Frequency could be another measure. Again, there's some questions about how easily you can measure frequency. The last one would be fear, or the impact on the victim. There was a survey in Australia that asked women how their fear of violence had changed their daily activities. But this seemed too subjective, and the Friends of the Chair Committee, which was made up mostly of these statisticians from many different, about 12, 15 countries, said fear is too subjective, it's too hard to measure, although there have been plenty of surveys that have done this. So what did they end up doing? They ended up proposing to measure moderate physical violence in terms of a series of acts, which any of you who've been in this field recognize as basically the conflict tactics scale type of acts, which has now become pretty much a global way of thinking about violence against women. So if you did not have bruises, cuts, broken bones, etc., and you had these acts, then this would be moderate. And severe physical violence is the first four categories if they're aggravated consequences, or the last categories, whether or not they're aggravated consequences. You all happy with this? This sort of. So where do you draw the line? Actually, different scholars draw the line at different places along this continuum. But you can see that this is totally a matter of judgment. There is no natural line here. This is one of these categories in which you take the line is established through just a kind of arbitrary distinction. They kind of proposed this. They kind of then backed off in the guidelines about exactly using this, but the problem remains of how you would measure severe versus moderate violence. And in this case, what's interesting is that the statistical division did a survey of measurement systems around the world, and they came up with, I can't remember, maybe 60 surveys, and this seemed to be the dominant approach. But then when you look at the countries that were carrying out these surveys, they were obviously countries that had the resources to do it. So typically global north, some Latin American countries, a few other countries that had some donor money to do it. But it really reflected a certain kind of country and not other countries. And so we get here the issue of the traveling template, right? You get a template established here and there, and this brings us to the social side of it. Who is the expert who can say, this is the way we did it in my country, so this is what's going to work? And that means that people in those countries have the model that then travels to other countries. Okay, so what gets neglected here? Obviously, the interconnectedness of different kinds of gender violence, the connections between gender violence and other forms of inequality and violence, poverty, racism, being a migrant, all these things, ideas about marriage and gender. The thing that's murky about violence against women is that there's a certain part of violence against women which is considered around the world to be discipline, which in many cases is the right of the husband or the male head of family to discipline the woman. And when does it shift from being discipline to being abuse is a cultural dividing line, and countries vary a lot. And one of the successes of a good violence against women movement is actually to move that line, to make things that used to be seen as appropriate discipline appear as abuse. And the program that I studied, this sort of feminist group in the 1990s, was clear that what they wanted to do was to take behavior that women thought was just part of life and convert it into a crime. And it's interesting, I looked at some historical records, and oh dear, I'm sorry about this. No, but then you won't be able to hear me. I have to stop gesturing. I think you need it. Yeah, so I will try not to gesture so much. So, what was I saying? Oh, anyways, so in this case, you could see women learning new ideas about this behavior. And I remember the women sitting around the room and one woman complaining that her partner had sex with her when she didn't really want it. And the person who was running the group said, well, that was rape. And she said, oh, well, it sort of felt like rape. And so here you see kind of a new understanding of this, not as discipline, but as violence. There are surveys, there was one done in 1999 in India, that showed that a substantial proportion of rural, uneducated women found that a husband had the right to beat her if she failed to cook the meals correctly, take care of the children well, clean the house. And I found this in 19th century records in Hawaii as well, and it's pretty widespread even among a lot of women's consciousness that there's certain kinds of behavior that if they do it wrong, their husbands, fathers, etc., have the right to discipline them. So again, the ideas about gender, family, kinship are really fundamental to understanding this process. There's nothing about state violence, police violence, structural violence, income inequalities, poverty, etc., poor housing, etc. No real attention to vernacular understandings of gender violence and human rights, how you might go about how local communities feel about it, which issues really concern women, whether this really reflects their own priorities, because this is done at the global level and it lacks any kind of local consultation. And of course, fear and the experience of women is not included, which is ironic considering that this is actually the fundamental thing that we really care about, is whether or not women are living in fear and terror and it's impacting on their lives or not, more than whether they got hit once in a while. So the process of producing these indicators has actually meant that what we might really want to know isn't being measured. So the third process is encoding, is putting things into these categories. And here, I think the demands of encoding are partly what pushes towards the kinds of choices that we see being made here. It's easier to measure acts, easier to measure frequency and injury than it is to count fear, psychological violence, economic violence, humiliation. Those kinds of things are much harder to quantify. And so because of the demands of encoding, putting things into categories, we tend to move towards things that look more objective and countable. And therefore, we miss the things that certainly, in my experience of doing research in this field, are really of greatest interest and concern to victims. So what I'm arguing is that this is a social process, and how it works depends on who's sitting around the table, who gets listened to, who is able to influence the shape of the survey and the categories and the encoding and so on. So I want to talk about the process a little bit of producing these indicators. And it seemed to me there were 4 competing frameworks at play during this period of time. And it's interesting to see how differently they defined the phenomenon, how they thought about it, who was involved, and then sort of my story kind of ends in 2013 about which one prevailed, but clearly more is going on, but I ended up writing the book and doing other things as well. So the first one is the UN Statistical Commission and the UN Statistical Division, that's the Secretariat, which is really concerned about coming up with things that have statistical rigor. They need country buy-in, because their idea is you produce a model, a survey, and guidelines, but then it's the national statistical offices that carry out this survey. And this means that it's really important to have something that countries want to do. So if the survey includes the question of how often the police violated women who were abused, there may not be so much enthusiasm to carry that survey out. Or how much does your military engage in abuse of its population during the, so you can see that there is some kind of sorting that takes place because you have to get the country buy-in. And also it has to be simple, has to be straightforward. You may have countries with relatively underfunded statistical offices, so it has to be kind of a short and easy thing, because not only do you want them to do it once, you want them to do it regularly to measure improvement. Just as an aside, there's a new mechanism to measure development called the Sustainable Development Goals, which are building on the Millennium Development Goals. And they include goals like improving violence against women, and these measures are used as the indicators for those SDGs. So what gets produced here is now being replicated elsewhere as a way of measuring global development. So it matters. So the second approach is one that the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women presented to the Human Rights Council, which I see as more of a human rights approach, which focused on social tolerance. How much general acceptance is there of this violence? So is this the sort of thing that everybody says is okay? Does it look bad? So what's the general world view? So here we get more to ideas about gender and violence and sexuality, which is clearly not in these indicators, but you can see it's a whole different way of conceptualizing the problem. There was another effort to produce indicators of violence against women that I talk about in this book, which looks at whole different ranges from safety in the street to female genital cutting to other domains where there's violence against women. So, but that's much harder to measure. It's this much broader contextualized study. There are criminal victimization studies, and here Holly's International Crime Victimization Study. Do you mind if I put you on the spot on that one? It is really a wonderful exemplar that took the WHO framework and really made an effort to produce a survey instrument that looked at issues like fear, seriousness, and so on, as well as more conventional crime data. So there is a lot of effort to measure violence against women through criminal justice statistics, but most of the time these are not done in any kind of sophisticated, subtle way, but they just ask people, have you been victimized by crime? And not surprisingly, as you all probably know, the number of times that this gets reported is very low. I did a survey in the kind of upper middle class town around Wellesley College where I used to teach, and people reported all kinds of problems that they had, but you'll be amazed to hear that none of them had any problems with domestic violence. They had neighbor problems and so on. People don't talk about this unless you make a special effort to make this visible. I don't believe that's true, by the way, but that's what they said. So criminal victimization surveys of a less sophisticated form are one of the ways that we can know how much violence against women there is, but it's clearly not a very reliable system by and large. So the fourth perspective is what I call the feminist perspective, which was embedded in this UN ECE ECLAC project, which incorporated the WHO approach of being very sensitive about training interviewers. It had things like humiliation, how various kinds of fear measures, so it had a more encompassing understanding of what violence against women is. This group invited the Statistical Commission people to come, and they hoped that they would use their survey in their final guidelines. The person who was behind it at the statistical division said there would be many modules. This is only one. He really was a little skeptical about the whole project. He told me, I said that he doesn't really know anything about gender violence, and he was really just into statistics. There were efforts, which I saw in other kinds of UN meetings, by feminists trying to bring this perspective into the final statistical guidelines. And incremental efforts from, the crime victimization studies, the UN ECLAC study, but also resistance, right, by the Statistical Commission. And when you think about it, who has the money to carry out these surveys? Who's going to actually make this happen among these four perspectives? It's going to be the Statistical Commission, who gets national statistical offices to do it, and maybe the conventional crime statistics data work, which involves, there are lots of global crime surveys being done by the UN Office of Drugs and Crime. So getting this idea into that framework was really important. So what did the guidelines look like? Well, they of course relied on the list of indicators approved by the UN Statistical Commission. But interestingly, when I looked at the final guidelines, some of these other ideas had crept in. They provided a more careful description of the methodology, a little bit more attention to the kinds of disclosure problems that were fundamental to the more feminist approach and were ignored by the statistical approach. Disclosure is a huge issue. Are people going to actually talk about this? And intriguingly, there was actually only one example of a survey instrument, and that was the one that the UN ECE ECLAC group had developed. And I was intrigued by this. How did this happen? Because it seemed so different. And here we get to the role of particular individuals, because the person who had been in charge of this project had left. A new person came who was much more interested in women's perspective, happened to be female, and also the final version of the guidelines was very heavily edited by the person who was engaged in producing the WHO indicator system in the first place. So they're sort of through the back door. all these other ideas came in. I still don't know why that was the only survey module that was included, but it was interesting that even though there was a lot of resistance, ultimately through kind of networking and being in the right place at the right time, this ended up being included in the final guidelines. So this is the analytical part. What I saw was that it's really important to look at the resources, the organizations, and theoretical frameworks underlying these approaches. So I gave you these 4 approaches, but you can see that they have very different kinds of institutional support. The Statistical Commission probably has the resources to make this happen, because they're going to go tell these national statistical offices to go out and do these surveys. And the fact that they're now included in the SDGs means there's going to be even more pressure to carry out this particular kind of survey. So again, it becomes consequential because it spreads. And again, it's important to see that this is a particular way of thinking about violence against women that's very narrow, that excludes lots of things, that doesn't look at all at larger structural issues, and that is going to become the kind of dominant global measure of this problem. And of course, there's always the worry that if the measurement, if the disclosure systems aren't well taken care of, if the interview is done in an uncareful way, if there are not sort of multiple ways of getting at this, we're going to have very low rates of measurement of this problem. As Henrietta Jensen, the person who worked on the WHO, told me, there was a survey in Indonesia that said that 3% of women experienced violence. And, you know, that's sort of the risk, that you'll get these surveys that show that this is a non-problem. And actually, I did some work in China where there are 2 different words for gender-based violence. One word is severe violence and injury, and the other is quarreling and fighting. And if you use the second word, you get a 30% rate, and if you use the first word, you get like a 5% rate. So there's a lot at stake here about how you actually measure it in terms of making this problem known and visible. So the organizations with the resources are going to be the ones who determine which surveys get done and which surveys get used. So in this case, the feminist framework by the UNECE-ECLAC and the human rights approach, neither of them have any money attached to them. There's no way any of these are going to actually produce survey instruments unless somebody else decides to do it. The UNODC, which is the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime, routinely does global crime surveys. And so they may ask about this, but in a very limited way. They like to ask about crimes. So they'll ask about rape, assault, etc. They'll use the categories of crime that are already in place, which, as we all know, misses lots of things that we might want to put under the framework of violence against women. So who has the resources to do this? Who has the resources to set it up is really important. I found in these meetings that different kinds of voices had different authority. So if you came from a country that's done lots of surveys, you could say, well, in my country, we did this and this and this and this, and okay. But if you come from a country which hasn't done these surveys, you say, it might be good to do it this way or that way. It's easy to dismiss that voice. And so those people tend not to be heard or incorporated in the discussion. So these are the kinds of global inequalities that are really worth thinking about. And of course, as we all know, the female voice somehow is harder to hear than the male voice. Anyway. And there are different theoretical frameworks. So in my 4 examples, the Statistical Commission's framework was, let's do good statistics, have clear categories. The crime victimization approach conventionally says, let's look at the crimes and whether or not the police responded effectively. So that's, again, a kind of a narrow focus that doesn't look at all these other issues. The human rights approach has a broader perspective saying, how are people's human rights being violated through this particular form of behavior? And so it has a much broader contextual perspective, but no resources to carry out these surveys. And the feminist approach, there's been a lot of research in this area, and yet again, there are not the resources to carry out these global surveys, which are very expensive. I mean, the whole problem of quantification does come down to issues about resources, and which is not something we talk about very much. So I think there are 2 important theoretical processes here that I wanted to flag. One is what I call expertise inertia. And that's the phenomenon that whoever has done this already becomes the expert that can tell other people how to do it. And what you see is a new problem comes along, and you look around for a template or model of how you might study that problem based on past experience. So one example of this is that when the U.S. decided to study trafficking, not sex trafficking, but trafficking in general, and come up with a way of dealing with it, measuring it, and responding to it, it turned to the model of drug trafficking. And there had been a system where countries who were not working hard to deal with their drug trafficking were ranked as bad, and those that were doing well were ranked as good. And so there was this hierarchy of countries established under the drug trafficking world, and those that were doing well got U.S. support and funding for their NGOs, and those that were doing badly got sanctions. This model was then taken to apply to trafficking, because again, this was initially thought of in the U.S. as a problem that the sending countries are not working hard enough to prevent people being trafficked. And so you took the drug model template and applied it to trafficking, which suggests that just like drugs, traffic victims have no agency. They just get moved around. And that kind of assumption is actually embedded in what's now the U.S. State Department's Trafficking in Persons Report, which does this, ranks countries by how well they're doing. It really focuses on prosecution. It sees trafficking as a problem of traffickers, not poverty, inequality, marriage, violent marriages, all the other things that might contribute to it. And of course, what trafficking is an extremely murky problem. Is it sex trafficking? Is it labor trafficking? And sex trafficking is, as you all probably know, a much more appealing topic than labor trafficking. You know, the middle-aged man who falls in debt because he's borrowed money to marry his children off and is working in a brick factory in India just doesn't generate the kind of support that the young virginal woman captured and carried off into a brothel in a big city has. And anyway, that's another issue. So expertise inertia is the fact that we tend to replicate templates and approaches, which means that those who've done it first have more influence in the next process. And it tends to limit in many ways the perspective. So some of the things that you may find problematic about these measurement systems are really the result of this expertise inertia. I don't mean this is deliberate. There's just a tendency, you got a new problem, let's look at who's already worked on it and knows how to do it. But insofar as this is now a global north phenomenon looking and an elite phenomenon, it doesn't really incorporate the voices of those who are being measured. The second issue is data inertia. And I told you that there's a big problem with gathering data. It's very expensive. If you've paid any attention to the SDGs, we now have 17 goals and 169 targets and 231 indicators and counting. 2 minutes, okay. And some people estimate that this is going to cost the same amount as 2 years of development budgets. I mean, so gathering data is very expensive. So what we tend to do is to use proxies. You take existing data, maybe it's measured something else, but you think, well, maybe this is good enough. So let's look at administrative data on violence against women. How many calls to the police? Well, we know this is inadequate, but it's available and it's free. So the data inertia means you may use proxies for what you really want to measure, and it's not actually measuring what you want to measure. So here are my conclusions. So I hope I've showed you that measurement systems are social constructs, that they are shaped by networks of actors, institutions, power relations. They develop over time. These are slow genealogical processes. They have inertia. The reason I use inertia is because, you get trajectories going. There are very important processes of interpretation, discretion. Individuals make a difference, particular contexts. Because of the need for commensuration, there is inevitably a limitation and narrowing in what you can count. This tends to strip context and complexity and produce homogeneity. You can see this in the trafficking world, where the whole variety of ways that people become involved in trafficking get kind of simplified into a more homogeneous population, which is clearly a problem as a basis of policy. And of course, measurement renders some things visible and others not. Oh, I don't have my list. So everybody says to me when I do this critique, so what would you recommend? How can you make it better? And since I only have 1 minute, no, I do have suggestions, because it seems to me that it's really important to get the perspectives of the people who are being measured and who are allegedly going to be helped into this system. This is difficult at the global level, and yet it's really a goal that can be imagined, that you find out what do women who are experiencing violence want to have known about it. What kinds of knowledge would be of help to them? What kind of local understandings might feed into policy decisions better than whatever expert opinions we might have? So incorporating local people is really important. Difficult. I know somebody who's working on child development, and I said, really, you need to incorporate local people. So they had this week-long meeting, and they brought a Guatemalan Indian woman in for 2 hours and said, so what do you think we should measure? This doesn't work. I don't know if she even spoke Spanish. So, so it takes more effort. Local NGOs do this all the time. We know that numbers are extremely powerful in building issues. When I was studying violence against women around the world, the first thing all these organizations did was surveys to see how common this problem is. So numbers can be very powerful. They can be worked really well, but the problem is that numbers are a technology available to those who have the resources to develop and use them. And so it's actually the unequal distribution of resources to do this really expensive project that is the fundamental thing that we have to worry about, which is why, frankly, the feminists had to try to persuade the Statistical Commission instead of just saying, we'll do it ourselves. And I think this is really the important part. I have said in articles that this is like witchcraft. And I was confronted by this with a group of political scientists in Italy who said, what? Statistics are like witchcraft? But they're like witchcraft in that witchcraft is a form of power. It's a supernatural form of power that can actually be used for healing or for injury. And so the power is really a neutral thing in some sense. It depends who's using it. And that's the same way quantification works. It is not inherently destructive. It's a matter of who has the resources to use it and use it to tell the story that they want to tell. So thank you all for listening.